Before I get on to the main business of this module, I'd first like to say a brief word about terminology. Over the course of about a century, we see a shift in terms used to describe those individuals who made it their job to treat the mentally disturbed. And I'd just like to go over those, as they are, like just about everything else, historically determined. In the 18th century, as we've already seen, the common designation was mad doctor. By the early 19th century, the alienist had come into vogue. This was an expression derived from Pinel's belief that when an individual suffered from madness, they were alienated from their true selves. William Tugge, the Quaker founder of the York Retreat, admired Pinel's expression so much, it chimed with him so well, that he brought the word into the English language as an expression for those who treated the mad in madhouses or the newly emergent asylums, with the implication that it was the job of the alienist to restore the mad to their true selves. Right the way into the second half of the 19th century, alienist was the preferred designation for what was once a mad doctor, although the psychiatrist as a term was introduced from Germany in the early part of that century and would become increasingly popular as the 19th century progressed, as a description for those medically qualified doctors who treated the mentally ill. One more piece of terminology to consider. Let us ponder the meaning of the term asylum. Because of its long history and the abuses that emerged within its walls, it became a word of foreboding. As a kid, I remember being driven to school in Haywards Heath in Sussex, England. Just on the outskirts of the town, a few miles from the school, the local asylum stood atop the fringe of a low hill. It was to us a place of foreboding as architecture and as a word. To be placed in the asylum was to be put beyond the bounds of society, beyond normal, and the idea that one might cross the threshold was mired in fear. But in reality, when the term was first employed to describe a hospital for treating the mentally ill, it meant exactly the same as it does now in the wider context of the word's meaning and use. So when we use the expression asylum seeker, we're describing people who are looking for a place of refuge, a place of sanctuary and of protection. And that was exactly what an asylum for the mentally ill was supposed to do, provide a place of retreat where an individual's disturbed world could be set to rights. However, before we move on to the asylum, I'd just like to recap some of the issues that we dealt with. In the 18th and through to the 19th century, the vast majority of pauper lunatics were treated either at home or within the workhouse, or poorhouse as they were sometimes called. The picture you see here is of the village that I grew up in. It looks English idyllic. You can tell the old age of the building at the bottom of the street, and it looks beautiful. When I grew up, it was where the printing press was housed. But way before that, it had been the workhouse, where those who could not work, either through age or infirmity, were housed at the parish's expense. Who knows how many mad people lived and died there. And then there was the range of different types of institutions, the large public hospitals like St Luke's and Bedlam, local public madhouses in cities like York, and then the large private madhouses like Hoxton, and of course there were the many more smaller institutions. And just as there was a wide variety of institutions, there was an equally wide variety of conditions experienced by those confined within these institutions. If we take the paradigmatic madhouse Bedlam, existing for hundreds of years, and a byword under the care of the Munros for the spectacle of madness, the opening up of the asylum to the general public for a fee, a place of entertainment, but also somewhere where the old-style brutal treatment of lunatics remained in place throughout the 18th century. The treatment of William Norris in particular became an icon of the brutality of the older style of madhouse. However, There were those other institutions that were edging towards the new style moral therapy, including Brislington House and Grateford Hall. Witness the dramatist Reynolds talking about his impressions of Grateford Hall. The unprepared traveller was astonished to find almost all the surrounding ploughmen, gardeners, threshers, thatchers, and other labourers attired in black coats, white waistcoats, black silk breeches and stockings, and the head of each bien poudré, frisé, et arrangé. These were the doctor's patients. Note the surprise, the fact of how respectable they looked, the fact that he couldn't tell that these people were lunatics. The bottom line was that if you could pay, you were, on the whole, likely to be better treated than if you could not. And then there was the emergence of moral therapy itself, captured in the legend of Pinel, the unchaining that didn't really happen, and also of Tuque and Chirurgi, all of whom sought, one way or another, to target reason through the emotions of the patient and through the authority of the mad doctor. However, it's probably best to see the movement as part of a general shift in thinking brought about by Enlightenment philosophy and a new emphasis on psychology and individualism, rather than stemming from just one person or just one place. This was of a piece with prison reform, which became so critical at the end of the 18th century, with individuals like John Howard pushing for a change in the way that punishment was used, pushing for a more humane and rational form of punishment. And, of course, the other great movement, perhaps the greatest of the movements of the time, the abolition of slavery. And these all represent a new perspective on the rights and freedom of individuals and what was and was not permissible in terms of the way that bodies and minds in these different contexts were treated. In Britain, after the horrors of Bedlam and Hoxton and other places had been revealed, and with the voice of reform growing ever louder, legislation was enacted to enable the construction of large public asylums to be run along the lines of moral therapy. And gradually, the institutions started sprouting up, usually with a superintendent in charge, who abolished restraints as a symbol of enlightened moral therapy. This is certainly what Connolly did when he was appointed to Hanwell, the Middlesex County Asylum, along with the introduction of entertainments, balls, dinners, the humanising of the patients. We can briefly examine the timeline of moral therapy's existence within the asylum, point by point, and note the rapid expansion that occurred from the 1840s onwards as the success of Connolly and the other moral therapists was trumpeted loudly across Europe and into the Americas. The heyday, indeed the halcyon days of the asylum, was the period from 1840 to 1870. The promise of cure, of therapeutic optimism, infused the enterprise. Initially, it might have been seen as a measure of the asylum's success that as fast as they could be built, the beds would fill up. But by the 1870s, the initial outpouring of optimism had waned, and individuals like Henry Maudsley, Connolly's son-in-law, turned from asylum practice to the neurologist's consulting rooms. From around about that point it was, as we will see, downhill all the way for moral therapy. But let us return to the optimism-fueled 1840s, and where better to look than our friend Charles Dickens on a tour to the United States, on a mission to boost his popularity and sales, while at the same time to be a purveyor of high-class reportage. As in Britain, the movement of moral therapy was afoot, the triumph of the system loudly proclaimed, and for a visitor like Dickens or other journalists, it was wondrous. The thought that such institutions could cure madness, that where there was once brutality and violence, there was now order and peace. The trust in any human being, with or without reason, was amply repaid, even down to the civilizing effects of eating with knives and forks like bourgeois diners. Trust them to be civilized, and their reason will return. Architecture, the use of space, became critical to this project, a point that I made forcefully in my little documentary. One of the first technical treatises on the subject was by none other than Connolly in his The Construction and Government of Lunatic Asylums, which was published in 1847. Here he emphasised issues around the environment. The ideal asylum would be situated in large grounds with low or low-looking walls, with a plentiful supply of fresh, clean air and water. The buildings themselves would be segregated according to sex and type of disturbance experienced by the patient, but inside it would be airy, light, encouraging. Space became an integral part of moral therapy. Of course, throughout the 19th century, the design of these institutions morphed, evolved, transformed. Early asylums like Bodmin were built almost upon panopticon lines, like the idealised prisons of the day, although over time the building would be added to and new structures erected in the grounds. Colney Hatch, the second asylum for the county of Middlesex, constructed a few years after Hanwell, was palatial in its design, a long rambling front and a thin building, kilometres of passages between wards and recreation rooms, large open landscape grounds, although as this image from the early 20th century shows, like many of these institutions, buildings were added across the grounds as the demands for the services of the asylum increased. And of course you can witness a similar progression elsewhere, for example the evolution of the Norfolk County Asylum. Perhaps one of the more radical shifts in asylum architecture occurred with the introduction of the villa system, which created individual buildings to treat different classes of patients. This remained popular throughout the 20th century. Larundel, near Latrobe, built in the 1840s, was a version of this type of asylum. Go and see it before it's gone. Within the moral therapy regime, and with the enactment of legislation and the expenditure of millions upon millions of pounds across the countries of Europe and America, it was argued, and indeed legislated, that the person in charge, the alienist, must be a medically qualified man, a dramatic transformation from the era of the mad doctor. While the legislation did not prevent non-medical practitioners setting up institutions for the care of the insane, or indeed the just plain unwell, it did ensure that only a medically qualified man could fulfill medical roles within state and parish-connected institutions. This was, in many regards, a symptom of the newfound authority of medicine, epitomised by the triumph of clinical thinking, which from the 18th century had been redrawing the map of disease using a combination of pathology and anatomy. Or at least it was a sign that the state accepted the legitimacy of orthodox over all others in matters of sickness, mental or otherwise. Whatever the cause, for the next 150 years or more, the asylum remained the principal place of training and practice for psychiatrists. But the dream of the therapeutic asylum did not last long. The inflating population seemed to undercut the personalised attention that moral therapy required. Public asylums across the Western world were swamped, full to capacity. Over the course of the 19th century, the numbers rose exponentially, clogging up what were quickly becoming warehouses of the insane. The growth in numbers in British asylums at the beginning of the 20th century, there were over 150,000 patients being treated. That's 20 people per 10,000 of the population, was matched elsewhere. In France, during the 1890s, there were over 108 asylums. In the German-speaking lands, in the same decade, there were over 200 public asylums and a similar number of private ones. The individual bed numbers for asylums towards the end of the 19th century gives us a clear idea of the scale. 2,200 at Colney Hatch and 2,600 at Hanwell. That's 4,800 beds for the county of Middlesex, which, it has to be said, included a large swathe of London. The numbers were often even more dramatic in the USA. At Milledgeville in Georgia, the asylum was expanded from 3,000 to 10,000 beds. Milledgeville provides a good case study of what can happen to the asylum over this period. Like many other states, Georgia passed its own Lunacy Act, the State Lunatic, Idiot and Epileptic Asylum Act. Milledgeville was opened in 1842. Like Hanwell, the Salpêtrière, or indeed virtually any asylum we care to mention, it had its iconic paternal figure in the form of the superintendent, Dr. Thomas A. Green, who served as resident physician from 1845 to 1879. He did all the things you'd expect of a great alienist. He abolishes physical restraint and runs the institution like an extended family, presiding over the iconic dinner with staff and patients daily. But by 1872, numbers have risen rapidly to the extent that the physician-patient ratio is an untenable 1 to 112. How could one physician exercise authority over that many patients? And then, after 1872, the numbers snowball and the institution becomes primarily custodial. It is extraordinary to think of a graveyard filled with over 25,000 corpses as at Milledgeville. Many of those 25,000 would have lived an extraordinarily long time within that institution. Of course, David Wright reminds us that for many patients, the length of time spent in the asylum was less than 12 months. Once improved, families would take their own back. The outcome was less certain for those who did not have families to go back to. But there was always a cadre of intractable, incurable patients who could not be cured and could not be discharged, or who had become too institutionalized to be able to cope in the outside world. And it was these that clogged up the system as they aged and died within the walls of the asylum. And similarly, the profession of psychiatry seemed to stagnate within the asylum. To be sure, progressive asylums would always establish a laboratory to attempt to identify the pathological profile of insanity. Typical of these was the West Riding Lunatic Asylum. The institution had been founded in the first flush of moral therapy, but little therapeutic innovation had occurred between then and 1866, when James Crichton Browne, as the new superintendent, established a laboratory and started recruiting the most ambitious young psychiatrists of his day. Two of these reached the summit of their profession, John Hewlings Jackson and David Ferrier. The problem was that it wasn't the profession of psychiatry. Both were what were called solidists. They believed that bodily malfunction, including brain malfunction, was at the root of all psychological disturbance. Hewlings Jackson was a rampant Darwinian, believing that what was often wrong with the individual was a result of his or her evolutionary inheritance. Ferrier was concerned with the nervous system and its part in mental disturbance, and Ferrier and Hewlings Jackson, along with Crichton Browne, the three of them, went on to found the influential journal Brain. To be sure, they also contributed to the Journal of Mental Science, which would go on to become the British Journal of Psychiatry and was really the alienist house journal. But both Hewlings Jackson and Ferrier are better known as neurologists, not psychiatrists. They both abandoned asylum practice for research on the nervous system and its relationship to the brain. They both consulted upon nervous diseases. And uncoincidentally, a very similar thing happened with Henry Maudsley, who was a prominent editor of the Journal of Mental Science and the son-in-law of Connolly. His alienist credentials could hardly have been better. It is an irony, given the trajectory of his career, that the name the Bethlehem Hospital, Bedlam, now possesses is the Maudsley. He gave the institution a bequest, and it rebranded itself. And initially we can see Maudsley thoroughly integrated with the project of the asylum and moral therapy. At the tender age of 23, he's appointed superintendent to the Manchester Royal Lunatic Asylum. That's in 1858. Returning to London in 1862, he married Connolly's daughter and then took over Connolly's private asylum, Lawn House, which he ran until 1874, when he abruptly resigned his position. He went on editing the Journal of Mental Science until 1878, but after that had no more to do with alienism. He would focus instead upon neurology. Why, we might ask, was this the case? All four of the individuals mentioned were the best and the brightest, and yet they all gravitated away from psychiatry towards neurology. One simple answer lies in the fact that with the increase in numbers, it was impossible to carry out the moral therapeutic program as envisaged. Indeed, moral therapy as a means of cure seemed to have failed in the large numbers of intractable cases. This made the role of the alienist more akin to a manager than a medical doctor. We can see this in the story told by Ernest Jones in his memoir. Jones was to become one of the brightest followers of Freud in the early 20th century. He'd followed a fairly typical path from medicine to psychiatry, but in 1905 had come across Freud's Dora case and began dabbling in psychoanalysis. This landed him in considerable difficulties on at least 2 occasions. In 1906 he was arrested for indecently assaulting 2 children at a home for mental defectives, where he was visiting as an inspector of schools. He claimed on Freudian grounds that the children were fantasizing, and at the initial hearing it was decided the case should be dismissed, as no jury would trust the testimony of such children. Again, in 1908, Jones had been challenged by a colleague to demonstrate the underlying sexual trauma that had caused paralysis in the arm of an adolescent girl. This he duly did, either through hypnosis or free association, but without consent from the girl's consultant or a chaperone being present in the room. He faced complaints from the girl's parents and was forced to resign his hospital post. He may have been a slippery character, or this may have been the price for his Freudian leanings. Certainly he went on to become a prominent psychoanalyst, one of the most prominent of the day, and he had nothing but contempt for the asylum psychiatrist. 2 Jones stories. When I was holding a resident appointment at University College Hospital, an asylum superintendent, whom I had met, telephoned saying he had a vacancy on his staff, and could I think of anyone who would be willing to fill it. He added, "I don't expect him to be interested in insanity, but he must be able to play cricket with the patients." And then, I remember a satirical friend of mine, himself an amateur psychologist, asking me once what alienists discussed at their meetings. "I suppose they read papers on an improved variety of chublock." In other words, playing cricket and figuring out the best ways to keep the patients in their wards was the business of the asylum psychiatrist. The trouble was that this wasn't that far from the truth. For one thing, the General Medical Council, which had been established in 1858, had failed to sanction psychiatry as part of the general curriculum for medical training. For another, aside from the laboratories like West Riding, there was very little concrete scientific research going on into insanity. This compared unfavourably with countries like Germany, where the laboratory method was king in terms of attempting to understand the conundrum of the mind. As we will see, Germany had claims to being the home of biological psychiatry. It was a problem recognised in Britain by some of the most powerful psychiatrists in the land. Commenting upon a report of 1889 undertaken by London County Council, which had a number of asylums within its boundaries, having absorbed Middlesex and parts of Essex, Surrey and Kent, David Yellowlees, the president of the Medico-Psychological Association, the principal society for psychiatrists, commented upon the accusations that in asylums the amelioration in the surroundings of the insane has been due to humanity rather than medical skill, and that from being shut up in asylums the insane were removed from the ordinary scope of medical observation and from the influence of the progress of medical science. The excuse for this statement is found in the assertion that asylum superintendents are mere administrators or house stewards and have neither the training nor time nor the capacity for medical investigation. As much as he then went on to attempt to counter this accusation, it was hard to disagree, particularly as the next article in the journal, where his speech was printed, was about the heating, ventilation and electric lighting of the hospital at the Montrose Royal Asylum. This was, in a nutshell, the problem of moral therapy within the asylum, and it had been there right from the very start. The birth of moral therapy provided 2 bequests. Let's name them the Lockean and the Tuchian. Locke develops a theory of the mind where the mind can be put right by persuasion, not medicine. The Tucian bequest is Locke made concrete. Sanity can be restored through kindliness, authority, and order. In both bequests, we are left with a question. In both bequests, we are left with a demand. Show me the medicine. As Tuke demonstrated, you did not need to be medically qualified to head up an asylum. And yet this was what happened. Medically qualified superintendents were ordained by the law, and the asylum became the principal venue for the practice of psychiatry as it emerged out of mad doctoring. Ultimately, because of these factors, moral therapy had to die. But the death of moral therapy did not signify the death of the asylum. These institutions lingered until the end of the 20th century and remained absolutely integral to the treatment of mental ill health. Although their names evolved, they became mental hospitals or state hospitals, but certainly not asylums for the insane. They remained one of the central places for the training and practice of psychiatry. Certainly, the spaces and places of psychiatry became increasingly varied, particularly with the advent of psychoanalysis as a therapy. Here, the psychiatrist could practice calmly, thoroughly, peacefully in his consulting rooms, seeing patient after patient, week upon week, month upon month, and year upon year. In the USA, psychoanalysis got many psychiatrists out of the asylum and into lucrative practice, where they barely see a psychotic symptom. Nerves and psychodynamic developments were the stock in trade for these practitioners. We will talk about this model more when we discuss Freudianism. Equally, the laboratory remained particularly important in German culture. The laboratory at the University of Heidelberg, which in the late 19th and early 20th century was run by the great classifier of mental illnesses Kraepelin, would boast some of the greatest names of the mind sciences, men who worked zealously to demonstrate the biological basis of mental illness. Alzheimer was typical of these. But the asylum would not die, with no effective treatments for severe psychotic disorders, and no social welfare system beyond institutionalization to care for those who had congenital conditions. The asylums were needed to care for these individuals. Increasingly, they became warehouses of the mad, overseen by psychiatrists who would be prepared to use the patients to test any new method that might alleviate one of humanity's greatest problems. They became, in some regards, a bizarre laboratory for speculative therapies.